Rumors had been circulating quietly for months that something was wrong inside the family, but no one imagined how dark things would become. Friends later said that Rob and his wife Michelle had privately shared worries about their adult son, Nick, yet those concerns stayed mostly behind closed doors. Just days before everything fell apart, Rob said something so simple and so honest that it barely registered with anyone who heard it. At a crowded Hollywood gathering, surrounded by laughter and music, he admitted 3 words that would later haunt everyone who remembered them. He said he was scared. At the time, it sounded like the exhausted confession of a father under stress, not a warning of what was about to happen. Less than a day later, Rob and Michelle were dead, and Nick was in police custody. That party became the last calm moment before the family's world collapsed. The night before his death, Rob was not at home resting. Instead, he attended a well-known holiday party hosted by a late-night television star, the kind of event where powerful people mixed casually and personal conversations were expected to remain private. It was an atmosphere built on unspoken rules, where everyone knew how to smile, listen, and move on without asking too many questions. But that night, something felt different. Nick was there too, even though he had not originally been invited. Rob and Michelle did not want to leave him alone, and that decision alone said more than they probably realized at the time. Several guests later said that Nick's behavior stood out in subtle but uncomfortable ways. He was not loud or violent, and he did not cause a scene. Instead, there was something uneasy about him, something that made people lower their voices or stop talking when he walked over. A few guests recalled that he repeatedly asked people whether they were famous, even when the answers were obvious. Others said they could not explain exactly why, but his presence made the room feel tense. At the time, no one thought to label it dangerous. It was simply strange. At some point during the evening, Rob and Nick had a confrontation. Accounts of the moment differ. Some witnesses remembered raised voices and sharp words, while others believed it was a short and controlled exchange that later took on more intensity in people's memories. What everyone agreed on was that it happened and that Rob looked shaken afterward. His body language changed. He seemed distracted and withdrawn. When he spoke to other guests later, he did not hide how deeply unsettled he felt. According to several people who were there, Rob admitted that he was afraid of his own son. Not just worried or stressed, but afraid. One person recalled him saying he felt petrified. Another remembered him saying he did not feel safe at home anymore. Still, no one treated it as an emergency. They saw a tired father dealing with a difficult family situation, not a man in immediate danger. The party eventually ended. Guests said their goodbyes and returned to their normal lives. What Rob said that night was brushed off as an emotional moment, something people assumed would pass. But less than 24 hours later, those words became the last clear record of his state of mind. Suddenly, casual comments made over drinks were re-examined as possible warnings, and memories that once seemed insignificant took on new meaning. Rob had been a towering figure in entertainment for decades. He was not just an actor or a director, but someone whose work shaped modern film and television. He first became famous for his role as a politically outspoken son-in-law on a groundbreaking sitcom that changed how families were portrayed on television. His performance showed a mix of humor, intelligence, and emotional depth that made him instantly recognizable. Later, he moved behind the camera and proved himself just as talented there. He directed films that became cultural landmarks, stories that balanced humor and heart and spoke to audiences of all ages. His movies explored friendship, love, fear, ambition, and vulnerability, and they did so in ways that felt honest and timeless. Beyond his professional success, Rob was also known as someone who spoke openly about social issues. He used his public platform to talk about justice, healthcare, and civic responsibility. Many people admired him not just for his creative achievements, but for his willingness to stand up for what he believed in. Those who worked with him often described him as generous and encouraging, someone who mentored younger artists and listened carefully to others. At home, he was devoted to his family. He and Michelle had built a life together based on mutual respect and shared values. They raised their children in an environment that emphasized creativity, empathy, and emotional openness. When news broke that Rob and Michelle had been found dead, the shock was immediate and widespread. The entertainment industry paused to mourn. Colleagues shared stories of his kindness and influence. Fans revisited his films and television work, remembering how deeply those stories had shaped their own lives. Tributes poured in from around the world. For many people, it felt like losing someone who had been part of their lives for years. But behind the public mourning was a private nightmare unfolding for the family. By the afternoon of December 14th, concern had turned into panic. A massage therapist arrived at the family's home for a scheduled appointment but received no answer at the door. After waiting and trying to make contact, she felt something was wrong and called the couple's youngest daughter, Romy, who lived nearby. Romy rushed over, driven by a sense of dread she could not shake. When she entered the house, she found her father lying motionless. Shocked and overwhelmed, she ran outside, not yet realizing that her mother had also been killed. Her roommate, who was with her, immediately called emergency services. Police arrived shortly afterward and confirmed the devastating truth. Both Rob and Michelle were dead. The scene was quickly treated as a homicide, and investigators moved fast. The area was secured, and detectives began reconstructing the final hours of the couple's lives. One detail became clear almost immediately. There were no signs of forced entry. Nothing suggested a random break-in. That fact narrowed the focus of the investigation to people who had access to the home, people the couple trusted. As the investigation unfolded, attention quickly turned to Nick. His behavior at the party, his proximity to the home, and statements made by family members all pushed him into the center of the case. Within hours, he was located near a public transit station and taken into custody without resistance. Witnesses later said he appeared calm and cooperative, a sharp contrast to the chaos surrounding the family at that moment. He did not make any public statements, and authorities released little information about the evidence they were relying on. The speed of the arrest surprised many people. It came before an official cause of death was announced and before investigators shared a clear timeline. Once an arrest was made, public opinion began to solidify almost instantly. Headlines formed narratives, and every past detail was reevaluated through a new lens. Rob's words at the party no longer sounded like an abstract expression of stress. They sounded like a warning people wished they had taken more seriously. Bail was initially set at a high amount and later denied altogether, intensifying public scrutiny. The question on everyone's mind was impossible to escape. Could a family tragedy of this scale really involve their own son? The idea was almost too painful to consider, yet it dominated conversations online and in the media. Friends and relatives struggled to reconcile the Nick they knew with the accusations being made. Some remembered moments of kindness and vulnerability. Others recalled long-standing tension and emotional instability. As the days passed, the story became less about fame and more about the fragile and often hidden struggles inside families. It forced people to confront uncomfortable truths about mental health, fear, and the limits of parental love. Rob's quiet confession at a party became a symbol of how warnings can be missed, not because people do not care, but because they cannot imagine the worst becoming real. What had once been a life defined by creativity and connection ended in a way no one could have predicted, leaving behind unanswered questions and a grief that would never fully fade. When police arrived at the house, the focus did not shift toward Nick because detectives were guessing or making quick assumptions. The first person to point them in his direction was someone who knew him better than almost anyone else. It was his sister. Romy was the one who discovered the scene, and what she told police that afternoon immediately shaped the investigation. The events of that Sunday did not begin with officers stepping into a silent home with no clues. Rob and Michelle had been expected at a private dinner later that evening, and when they failed to show up or answer calls, concern had already started to grow. By the time law enforcement arrived, they were not entering a blank slate. They were entering a situation where a family member had already shared a clear and troubling belief. When detectives spoke with Romy, she did not hesitate. She told them directly that Nick should be considered a suspect. She also explained why. She said he was dangerous. That single word carried enormous weight. It helps explain why the arrest happened so quickly. This was not a slow-moving investigation built over days or weeks. Police had someone who lived nearby, who had regular contact with Nick, and who knew his recent behavior pointing straight at him within hours of discovering their parents' bodies. That kind of statement is not proof, but it is a powerful starting point. It also raises an uncomfortable question that many people have struggled with since. What had Romy seen or experienced that made her use such a strong word at such a devastating moment? Her reaction appeared immediate and instinctive, not something she carefully calculated. That suggests whatever had been happening with Nick in the days, weeks, or months before December 14th was serious enough that his own sister did not pause before identifying him as a threat. To understand why she felt that way, people have begun looking closely at Nick's past, and that is where the story becomes even more complex. Nick was not an unknown figure suddenly dragged into public view. Much of his history was already public, and much of it came directly from him. Over the years, he spoke openly about struggles with addiction, relapse, and periods of homelessness that began when he was still young. In interviews, he described long stretches of his life as dark and unstable. In one conversation years earlier, he said plainly that during those times, he could easily have died and that survival often felt like a matter of luck. Those words existed long before this case. At the time, they were received with sympathy and concern. Now, they are being reread through a very different lens. This shift is where the narrative becomes uncomfortable. The same personal history that once inspired empathy is now being used by some people to explain or justify suspicion. That does not mean the history is irrelevant, but it does mean it is being asked to carry more weight than it was ever meant to. Rob spoke often about trying to protect his son and help him through those struggles. He described himself as a hands-on parent who tried to stay involved, no matter how difficult things became. He believed that being present mattered more than anything else. Their shared film project years earlier was loosely inspired by Nick's experiences and by the strain addiction can place on families. At the time, both father and son were clear about what the film was and what it was not. It was not a confession, not a reenactment, and not a warning. It was a dramatized way of exploring pain, conflict, and recovery. That distinction was important then, and it is even more important now. Looking back, Rob reflected on the process with honesty. He admitted that they argued during the making of the film, but he also said those arguments led to deeper understanding and, in his view, made him a better father. Police sources later indicated that investigators focused on Nick early in part because of his background. From a procedural standpoint, that is not unusual. In cases involving violent deaths inside a private home, law enforcement almost always examines immediate family members first. Access to the home, proximity, and familiarity with the environment make that unavoidable. That focus does not equal guilt, but in the public eye, those distinctions often disappear. Once a name is attached to suspicion, it can be difficult to separate fact from assumption. This is where an important detail often gets lost. There have been no public claims of prior physical violence between Nick and his parents. No restraining orders have been reported. No official records have been released showing a pattern of escalating threats. Investigators have not described a clear series of warning signs leading directly to the deaths. Without those elements, history alone cannot answer the question everyone keeps asking. It can provide context, but it cannot serve as proof. This is the pressure point of the entire case. When private family struggles are pulled into a criminal investigation, they can either help clarify what happened or distort it. Which outcome applies here depends entirely on the evidence, not on speculation or emotion. Despite the arrest and the confidence many people have already formed, authorities have not released the forensic details that would settle the matter. That silence has frustrated the public, but it is also significant. After Nick's arrest, the case entered a new phase. The shock and urgency of the first hours gave way to procedure. Nick remains in custody, charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Prosecutors have stated that the charges could carry life without parole and possibly the death penalty, though no final decision has been announced. His court appearance is scheduled for early January. At this stage, investigators are no longer reacting emotionally. They are building a case that must stand up in open court. That means medical examiner reports, estimates of time of death, digital records, phone data, location information, and witness statements that can survive cross-examination. Every assumption made in the early hours will be challenged by defense attorneys whose job is to find weaknesses and inconsistencies. What makes this case especially unsettling is that fear alone cannot establish guilt. No matter how disturbing Rob's words sound in hindsight, they cannot prove what happened. Fear describes a state of mind, not an action. Prosecutors understand that. Defense attorneys understand it even more clearly. That is why so much information remains undisclosed. Authorities have not explained how they believe the killings occurred. They have not released forensic evidence tying Nick directly to the scene. They have not detailed what specifically turned suspicion into an arrest so quickly. This silence is not accidental. It is strategic. Once those details are made public, the case becomes something that can be tested. If the evidence supports the theory forming in the public imagination, it will reinforce it. If it does not, the narrative could shift dramatically. Meanwhile, Rob and Michelle's surviving children have asked for privacy and restraint. They have not made public accusations or offered alternative explanations. They have simply asked for space and for the legal process to unfold without interference. In a case where emotions are running high and opinions are forming rapidly, that request carries weight. The central question remains unanswered. When the evidence is finally presented in court, will it confirm what Rob's fear seemed to suggest, or will it reveal that fear alone led everyone down the wrong path? Until that evidence is made public, certainty remains out of reach, and the line between suspicion and proof remains as important as ever.